On to UNFCC summits, the Conference of Parties is the decision-making body of UNFCC. All states that are party to the convention are represented at COP. They review the implementation of any legal instruments that the convention adopts. Now, CMP is the Conference of Parties serving as the meeting of parties to Kyoto Protocol, and CMA is the Conference of Parties serving as the meeting of parties to Paris Agreement. Now, the first COP was held at Berlin, which gave the Berlin mandate. COP3 is important for its Kyoto, as Kyoto Protocol was adopted. Now, 2002, COP8 was held in New Delhi, India. Then we have 2012 COP18, which was held in Doha. Then we have the COP21, which was held in Paris, and then we have the subsequent COPs from there on. Now, moving on to Kyoto Protocol, that was COP3 in the UNFCC Summit of 1997. Now, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in Kyoto, Japan in 1997 and came into force in 2005. It aims at cutting greenhouse gas emissions across developed world by about 5% by 2012 compared with the 1990 levels. While India ratified the protocol in 2002, USA never ratified it. Canada withdrew from it in 2012. Now, Kyoto Protocol is based on principle of common but differentiated responsibility and is the only global treaty with binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions. Common but differentiated responsibility means that while every country, both developing and developed, must take part in the fight against climate change, historically biggest polluters like USA, UK, Russia should contribute more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions compared to recent polluters like India, China, Brazil, etc. Now, parties under the Kyoto Protocol are classified in Annex 1, Annex 2, Non-Annex 1, Annex B, and least developed countries. So these are basically 5 classifications. Now, Annex 1 are the developed countries like USA, UK, Russia, and economies in transition like Ukraine, Turkey, and some East European countries are part of the Annex 1 countries. Now, Annex 2 countries are the developed countries. Annex 2 is a subset of Annex 1 countries. These countries are required to provide financial and technical support to economies in transition and developing countries to assist them in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, Annex B countries are Annex 1 countries with first or second round Kyoto greenhouse emission targets come under Annex B countries. The first round targets apply over 2008 to 12 and the second round targets apply over 2013 to 20. Countries under Annex B have compulsory binding targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, non-Annex 1 countries are those parties to UNFCCC not listed under Annex 1 of the convention. They include mostly low-income developing countries and have no binding emissions for emission reduction targets. Now, least developed countries are the countries that have no binding greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. Now, the Kyoto Protocol has 2 commitment periods, 2008 to 12, 2013 to 20. The second commitment period was agreed in 2012, known as the Doha Agreement to the Protocol. As of January 2019, 124 states have accepted the Doha Agreement. Japan and Russia did not sign the second Kyoto term, as it would impose restrictions on it, not faced by competitors like India and China. Now, each commitment period has its own set of binding greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets for the developed countries to achieve. Nations that miss their Kyoto targets will have to incur a penalty, like getting banned from participating in cap-and-trade program. Now, Kyoto Protocol binds only the developed countries because it recognizes that they are largely responsible for current high levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, which are the result of more than 150 years of industrial activity. Now, Kyoto Protocol emission target gases like CO2, CF6, CH4, HFCs, N2Os, and PFCs. Now, flexible market mechanism. Countries bound to Kyoto targets can meet a part of their targets through 3 market-based mechanisms, that is clean development mechanism, emission trading, cap and trade, and joint implementation. So these are the 3 mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol flexible mechanism. Moving on, under the clean development mechanism, the project's handed pertains only to Annex 1 countries. Note that carbon tax, that is the tax on fossil fuel in proportion to carbon dioxide emissions, is not related to Kyoto Protocol. Not related. Moving on, some of the important UNFCC summits post-Kyoto are COP13, that is Bali Meet. Here the government adopted the Bali Roadmap Map, which included reviewing the financial mechanism to fund climate change initiatives. COP14, we have Poznań, that is Poland Summit. Adaptation Fund was launched at this summit. This one is financed in part by government and private donors and also from a 2% share of the proceeds of certified emission reduction certificates issued under the Clean Development Mechanism projects. Adaptation Fund is supervised and managed by Adaptation Fund Board. The Global Environment Facility GEF provides secretariat services to Adaptation Fund Board, and World Bank serves as a trustee to the Adaptation Fund on interim basis. Now, COP15, that is the Copenhagen Summit, is a legally binding agreement. A legally binding agreement could not be arrived at this summit. So in Copenhagen, a legally binding agreement could not have been arrived at, and summit due to disagreement between developed and developing nations. The summit thus concluded with the COP taking a note of the Copenhagen Accords, a 5-nation accord between USA and basic countries, that is India, China, Brazil, and South Africa. Now, developed countries promised to provide $30 billion for the period of 2010 and 12 to mobilize long-term finance for further $100 billion a year by 2020 from a variety of sources. Now, this was fast-track finance, something fast finance. COP16, that is Cancun Summit, parties agreed to establish a Green Climate Fund to provide financing to projects, programs, policies, and other activities in developing countries. Now, Green Climate Fund is based in Incheon, South Korea, and World Bank serves as invited was invited to serve as an interim trustee. Now, Green Climate Fund is intended to be the centerpiece of efforts to raise climate finance of $100 billion by 2020. A technology mechanism was also established in this summit. So Cancun Summit also has a technology mechanism apart from Green Climate Fund. It was expected to facilitate the implementation of enhanced adoption of technology development and transfer in order to support action on mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Now, Durban Summit, governing instruments for Green Climate Fund was approved in this summit. In Doha Summit, government agreed to work towards a global climate change agreement. The conference also reached an agreement to extend the life of the Kyoto Protocol. It was also decided that UNEP-led consortium will be host of Climate Technology Center. The Climate Technology Center is implementing arm of Unfccc technology mechanism. Now, Warsaw Summit, which was COP19, intended nationally determined contribution was coined in this summit. So in Warsaw, INDCs were coined. Governments also decided to close the pre-2020 ambition gap, the gap between what has been pledged to date and what is required to keep global temperatures below a maximum average of 2 degrees Celsius. Now in Lima summits, NEP, that is National Adaptation Plans, were prepared. Nazca Climate Action Portal was launched with the support of UNFCCC. Lima Work Program on Gender was initiated to advance gender balance in climate-related measures. UNFCCC's NAMA Day, that is Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Action, was special event that took place. Now, some outcomes of Paris Agreement were COP21, that is Paris Agreement. This is very important. Now, all the COPs from Paris Agreement onwards, Paris Summit onwards, become very important. Now, some of the key agreements of Paris Agreement were Paris Agreement entered into force in 2016 after the ratification by 55 countries that account for at least 55% of the global emission. India signed and ratified the agreement in 2016, and as of 2019, 180 plus countries have ratified it. Intended nationally determined contribution commitments were made by major polluters. The objective of the agreement was to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. Further, countries should pursue to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. Moving on, developed countries reaffirmed their commitment to mobilize $100 billion a year climate finance by 2020 to help developing countries cope with the climate change. It was also decided that a global stock take every 5 years to assess the collective progress towards achieving the purpose of the agreement and to inform further individual actions by parties. Earlier, USA had announced its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement but has rejoined recently. Now, COP22, which is Marrakesh Summit, the key outcomes where COP22 was also called Action COP or Agriculture COP. Accordingly, adaptation of African agriculture, that is AAA, was launched at this conference. There were deliberations on orphan issues that are referenced in Paris Agreement but not assigned to another body for further reconsideration. Now, directions were given to conduct an early stocktake through facilitative dialogue. Few nations submitted mid-century strategies to combat climate change. In line with this, a new initiative called 2050 Pathway Platform was launched to help other countries develop their own mid-century strategies. Now, COP23, which is Bonn Summit, was chaired by Fiji. So it was chaired by Fiji but was held in Germany. Some key outcomes were Fiji became the first small island state to hold the UNFCCC climate talk. Gender Action Plan highlighted the role of women in climate action was launched. Local Communities and Indigenous People Platform, that is LCIPP, aimed at bringing together people and their knowledge system to build a climate-resilient world was launched. Ocean Pathway Partnership was launched, thus formally recognizing the links between ocean and climate change. Talona Dialogue, Talanoa Dialogue, a process aimed at helping countries implement and enhance their nationally determined contributions was 2020, was launched. Powering Past Coal Alliance was launched in COP 2023, led by UK and Canada. The alliance is aimed at accelerating clean growth and achieving rapid phase-out of traditional coal power. Now, INSU Resilience Global Partnership is a joint partnership of G7, G20, and V20, that is Vulnerable 20, which is a group of 49 most vulnerable countries, including small islands. It was launched in COP23, that is Bonn Summit, chaired by Fiji, to strengthen the resilience of developing countries and protect the lives and livelihoods of poor and vulnerable people against the impact of disaster and other climate risks. Now, moving on to COP24, that is Katowice Summit, the conference agreed on work program for implementation, guidelines and rulebooks for reaching the targets mentioned to implement the Paris Agreement, which will come into force in 2020. The rulebook will prescribe how governments will measure and report on their emissions cutting efforts. Now, COP25, that is Madrid Summit, owing to its original location in Chile, a nation with around 4,000 miles of coastline, the leadership dubbed this year's event as Blue COP. So, Madrid Summit was held in Spain, but it was held under the presidency of Chile. The leadership dubbed this year's event as Blue COP, laying out its intention to focus on oceans. Now, COP also highlights the fact that there is no longer a climate crisis but a climate emergency. Recently, UK and Ireland became the first and second countries respectively to declare a climate emergency. Now, the Santiago Network was established to categorize the technical assistance required by most vulnerable countries. Now, in Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage came into being in 2013. So that is COP19. Under loss and damage, rich countries who have historical responsibility for climate change are asked to be liable to the developing countries who are already facing climate change impact. The SUVA Expert Dialogue on Loss and Damage was held under the aegis of UNFCCC, which discussed risk assessment, risk transfer, risk reduction, and retention and comprehensive risk management approaches to extreme weather events and slow onset of climatic processes. Now, carbon mechanisms under the Paris Agreement are Market Mechanism 1 and Market Mechanism 2. Market mechanism 1 sets up a carbon market which allows countries to sell any extra emission reductions called as internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, that is ITMO, which they have achieved compared to the nationally determined contribution, that is NDC's target. This is a voluntary direct bilateral cooperation between countries aiming to promote sustainable development. Now, market mechanism 2 is the second mechanism that will create a new international carbon market for trading of emission reductions created anywhere in the world by public or private sector. This new market is referred as Sustainable Development Mechanism, which seeks to replace Clean Development Mechanism of Kyoto Protocol. The delivery of overall mitigation in global emissions is a key requirement of SDM. That'll be it.